The bill landed on the table with the quiet certainty of a death sentence. Marco Vitelli did not look up immediately. That was the thing about men like him. They made the world wait. Every second of his attention was a currency, and he spent it carefully, deliberately, as if even the act of looking at something was a decision that could not be taken back. He sat at the corner table of Rosario's, the restaurant his family had owned for 30 years, the restaurant where deals were made and debts were collected, where the wine was always excellent and the silence was always understanding. He sat in the chair that faced the door, always the chair that faced the door, and he finished the sentence he was reading in the file before him, before he allowed his eyes to drift downward to the small white paper rectangle that had been placed beside his water glass. The number written on it stopped his blood cold. Not a phone number, not a table number, not the sum of what he owed for the meal, which of course he never paid for, because a man like Marco Vitelli did not pay for meals in restaurants his family owned with blood and silence stretching back 3 decades. It was a code, 7 digits written in blue ink, in the handwriting of someone who had not been trembling when they wrote it. Someone who had known exactly what they were putting on that paper and had done it anyway. He looked up. The waitress was already halfway across the restaurant, carrying a tray of drinks to another table, her back straight, her steps unhurried. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not check if he had seen it. She simply moved through the room like someone who had done what needed to be done and was not afraid of what came next. Marco Vitelli's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Across the table from him, his lieutenant, a man named Caruso, who had survived 17 years in Marco's service through the twin virtues of loyalty and exceptional situational awareness, noticed the stillness that had come over his employer and went very, very quiet. "Boss," Caruso said softly. Marco did not answer. He folded the bill once, precisely, along its center, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he picked up his wine glass and took a single measured sip, and set it back down, and looked across the restaurant at the woman who had just handed him what he now understood was either a warning or a trap, possibly both. Her name, he would learn, was Elena Vasquez, and she had no idea that the number she had written on that bill, the number she had memorized from a document she was never supposed to have seen, had just made her the most dangerous woman in the city or the most dead. Rosario's was the kind of place that existed in the particular overlap between legitimate business and the other kind. The tablecloths were white linen, the candles were real wax. The sommelier knew his Barolo from his Brunello, and the kitchen produced food that had been written about in papers whose restaurant critics were known to be difficult to impress. On a Tuesday evening in November, it was perhaps 2/3 full, the low murmur of conversation running beneath soft music that no one was listening to, the kind of ambient soundscape that expensive restaurants maintained so that private conversations remained private. Marco had eaten here every Tuesday for 11 years. It was not sentiment that brought him back. It was discipline. Routine was armor, and Marco Vitelli was a man who believed in armor above almost everything else. He was 41 years old, though he could have passed for 36 or 50, depending on the quality of the light and the expression on his face. He was not a physically imposing man, in the way that people imagined when they thought of the word dangerous. He was lean rather than large, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was more architectural than handsome, all angles and controlled stillness. His eyes were a shade of dark gray that people who had been on the receiving end of his attention sometimes described afterward, in hushed tones, as the color of water just before a storm. He had run the Vitelli organization for 8 years, since his father had died of a stroke at the dinner table in this very restaurant, in this very corner, in the chair that Marco now occupied. Every Tuesday without fail, he had taken over a fractured, bleeding operation, and in 8 years had rebuilt it into something that ran with the cold efficiency of a well-maintained machine. People in his world used the word ruthless carefully because it was a word that lost its weight when applied too freely. They applied it to Marco Vitelli with full knowledge of what it cost, and yet there were things even the most careful observers did not know about him. that he kept a single photograph in his wallet, folded so small it was nearly invisible, that he sometimes sat in his office at 2 in the morning not working, not planning, simply sitting in the darkness with an expression on his face that no one who worked for him had ever been allowed to see, that he had walked away from one thing in his life, one thing, and that walking away from it had cost him something he had never fully named. These were the things Elena Vasquez could not have known when she wrote that number on his bill. She had come to Rosario's 14 months ago. Marco knew this not because he paid attention to the waitstaff. He did not, as a rule, pay attention to people who served him, but because Caruso kept meticulous records of everyone who entered Marco's orbit, however peripherally. Her file was thin, 28 years old, originally from a city 300 miles south, culinary school dropout, spotless employment record, no known associations of concern. She had been hired by the manager, Paolo, who trusted her because she was punctual and professional and did not ask questions about things that were not her business. She had served Marco's table twice before. He had not noticed her particularly. She was competent, quiet, and did not perform the particular brand of nervous deference that most people offered him, which he found both expected and faintly tedious. She simply did her job until tonight. He watched her now from beneath the level gaze he had perfected over years of needing to observe without appearing to observe. She was of medium height, dark-haired, with the kind of posture that came not from training but from something internal, some habitual decision to take up space carefully and deliberately. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of someone who had learned, perhaps early, to be precise. She smiled at the table she was serving, and the smile reached her eyes, but only to a certain depth, the way a flame can be visible through a frosted glass. She was not afraid. That was the thing that Marco Vitelli could not stop returning to, the thing that sat in his chest with the weight of something he had not anticipated. She was not afraid. He had given her ample reason to be. When he had looked up from that bill, when his eyes had found her across the room with the particular quality of attention that had made grown men forget their own names, she had been looking back at him, not quickly, not with a caught-out flicker of panic. She had met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, the precise amount of time that could be interpreted as either bold or careful, and then she had turned back to her work as if she had simply confirmed something she already knew. Caruso leaned forward very slightly. "Do you want me to?" "No," Marco said. The word was quiet. The conversation was over. He wanted to speak to her himself. He waited until the restaurant had thinned to its late evening crowd before he signaled for her. Not loudly. He was not a man who raised his voice to get attention. He simply turned his water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth, a gesture that meant nothing to anyone except Paolo, who had been watching for it for 8 years and who crossed the room immediately and murmured something to Elena, and Elena set down the tray she was carrying and walked toward the corner table. She did not walk quickly. She did not walk slowly. She walked at exactly the pace of someone who had decided how they were going to walk before they began. She stopped beside his table and looked at him with those dark, careful eyes and said, "Can I get you something?" Her voice was steady, medium-pitched, the voice of someone who had learned how to keep things out of it. "Sit down," Marco said. A lesser person would have said, "I can't, I'm working," or would have looked around for someone to help them navigate the suddenly dangerous social terrain of being asked to sit by Marco Vitelli. Elena Vasquez looked at the chair across from him, and then she looked at Marco, and then she pulled the chair out and sat down. He let the silence run for a moment. This was a technique he had used 10,000 times in 100 different contexts, with 100 different people. The silence that followed an unexpected action. The silence that most people rushed to fill because they could not bear the pressure of it. He watched her hands rest flat on the table, perfectly still, and he understood that she was not going to fill it. "Where did you get that number?" he said. It was not a question. It was stated with the flat certainty of a man who had already decided he was going to get an answer. Elena looked at him steadily. "Which number?" The pause that followed was the kind that had temperature. "It was cold, I think," Marco said softly. that you know exactly what I'm asking you, I think. Elena said, and her voice did not waver even slightly, that you should decide what you're going to do before you ask me anything else. Because once I answer, we're both past the point of being able to pretend this conversation didn't happen. Marco Vitelli looked at her for a long moment. He had not expected that. He picked up his wine glass, set it down. The candlelight moved across the table between them like something alive. Then let's not pretend, he said. Elena had known this moment was coming for 6 days. 6 days since she had found the document folded inside the lining of her dead sister's coat, the coat that had arrived in a battered cardboard box along with the other small, terrible artifacts of a life cut short. 6 days since she had unfolded that paper with shaking hands in the kitchen of her small apartment at 2 a.m, and read the numbers and the names and understood, with the sick clarity of someone who has just stepped off a ledge, exactly what her sister had died for. Her sister's name had been Sophia, 25 years old. Dead 11 months ago, officially ruled an accidental overdose, a verdict that Elena had never believed for a single day but had been unable to disprove until that paper arrived and told her everything. Sophia had been working as a bookkeeper for a logistics company, a clean, legitimate job, or what appeared to be a legitimate job. She had been careful, she had been smart, and she had been, Elena now understood, quietly collecting evidence against the people who employed her, writing down account numbers and trants, for codes and names in a handwriting so small it was nearly invisible, and hiding it in the lining of a coat she had given to Elena the last time they saw each other, 3 weeks before she died, a coat she had pressed into Elena's hands at the train station with a fierceness that Elena had attributed, at the time, to ordinary sisterly love. She understood now what it had really been. It had been a last instruction: keep this, and if something happens to me, use it. The number on the bill was the primary account number from that document, the number that sat at the center of a financial architecture, so carefully constructed and so deeply buried that only someone who had spent months digging through it could have found it. Elena had written it on Marco Vitelli's bill because she had spent 6 days trying to decide what to do with what she knew, and she had arrived at the conclusion that the man most likely to recognize it was the man most likely to know what it meant and who it belonged to. She had not known what he would do when he saw it. She had accepted that whatever he did might be the last thing that happened to her. That was not courage. Elena had learned, in the 11 months since Sophia died, that the things people called courage were usually just what happened when your grief got bigger than your fear. She sat across from Marco Vitelli now in the thinning restaurant and looked at the man who controlled half the city's underworld infrastructure, and she thought about Sophia's handwriting, small, precise, careful, and she breathed the account Marco said. His voice was very quiet. This close, she could see details she hadn't registered from across the room. The faint line of tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his right hand rested on the table with a stillness that was deliberate rather than relaxed. He was controlling himself very carefully. You know what it belongs to. I know what it belongs to, Elena confirmed. And you understand what it means that you know. Yes. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. Then you also understand that there are people who would consider your knowledge to be a problem that needs to be resolved. I understand that, Elena said. I also understand that those same people already resolved my sister, and it didn't stay resolved. The silence that followed that sentence was extraordinary. Marco did not move. His expression did not change, not exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes, some internal recalibration that happened so quickly and so privately that Elena almost missed it. She did not miss it. Your sister, he said, Sophia Vasquez. She worked for Meridian Logistics. She died 11 months ago. I know who she was. 3 words that told Elena everything and nothing. She kept her face still, and her hands flat on the table, and waited. She came to us. Marco said, and the us landed with a weight that Elena had not anticipated. Not them. Not those people, but us. A single syllable that contained an entire architecture of belonging that he had not bothered to hide. 6 weeks before she died, she had information she wanted to trade. We told her we needed verification before we could move. She agreed to get it. He paused. She didn't come back. Elena felt something move through her chest, not quite pain, not quite rage, something that was both and neither, something that had been waiting 11 months to find its shape. She didn't come back, she repeated softly, because someone told them she was coming. Marco's jaw moved, almost imperceptibly, but she saw it. Yes, he said. The candle on the table between them guttered in a draft from somewhere, throwing shadows sideways. And for a moment the corner of Rosario's felt very far from the rest of the world. He sent Caruso home. This was, Caruso understood, not a request, and also not an ordinary occurrence in 11 years of working for Marco Vitelli. He had been sent home from a meeting exactly twice before, both times in circumstances that had preceded significant events. He put on his coat and left with the careful expression of a man who was filing everything away, and would be available by phone the instant he was needed. The last of the other diners drifted out. Paolo locked the front door, exchanged a look with Marco that communicated a great deal without any words, and disappeared into the back of the restaurant with the rest of the staff. Marco and Elena were alone. He refilled his wine glass. He looked at the second glass on the table, Caruso's glass, still clean, still unused. He picked up the bottle and looked at her in a way that was not quite a question. Elena nodded, almost imperceptibly, and he filled it. She had not expected that. The small, ordinary gesture of it, the courtesy of it, sat strangely against everything she knew and feared about him. She picked up the glass and held it and did not drink. The document, Marco said, what exactly does it contain? Account numbers, transfer records going back 4 years, names coded but cross-referenced, and one clean number, direct, unencrypted, the kind of number you only write down if you want someone to be able to use it immediately. Elena looked at him steadily. I think Sophia wrote it that way on purpose. I think she knew toward the end that she wasn't going to have time to bring you the full document, so she left me a shortcut to me. To whoever recognized it, you were the one who recognized it. Marco set down his glass with a care that she was beginning to understand, was habitual, every movement he made was calibrated, contained, as if he had decided long ago that the world did not deserve to see him uncertain. The number belongs to a holding account. It's the linchpin of a financial network that has been operating under several layers of legitimate business for over a decade. The people who run it have never been touched. He paused, because the people who run it are very good at touching other people first. Like Sophia. Elena's grip on the wine glass tightened slightly. She made herself loosen it. Then why hasn't anything happened to me? Marco looked at her with those storm, gray eyes. Because until tonight, no one knew you had it. And now you know, now I know. The sentence sat there between them. Elena looked at him and understood that she was at the precise hinge point of something, that the next few minutes would determine a great many things, possibly including whether she left the restaurant at all. She had accepted this possibility when she wrote that number on his bill. She was still here. She was still breathing. She kept breathing. Then I suppose, she said quietly, that the question is what you intend to do with that information. Marco Vitelli looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight moved between them. Somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a door closed softly. The same question, he said, could be asked of you. It was after 11 when Elena finally stood to leave. The restaurant was entirely empty now, the chairs turned up on most of the tables, the kitchen dark. Marco had remained seated, watching her with the particular quality of attention she was becoming accustomed to. Not predatory, exactly, but total. The kind of attention that felt like being the only lit window in a dark street. You'll be followed, he said. Not a threat, a statement of geography, I know. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. I've been followed for 6 days. Something flickered across his face, too brief to name, but she caught it. And you still came here. I still came here, he stood then. He was taller than she had registered when he was seated, and the movement of him rising from the chair had a quality to it, controlled, deliberate, that made the room feel slightly smaller. He crossed to where she was standing and stopped at a distance that was neither threatening nor comfortable, close enough that she could see the collar of his shirt, the precise knot of his tie, the single line of tension across his shoulders that never fully released. "Go home," he said quietly. "Don't open the document again. Don't write anything down. Don't contact anyone." She looked up at him. And then, Marco said, "we see what the morning looks like." It was not reassurance, it was not a promise. It was the kind of thing said by a man who was already 3 moves ahead in a game she was only beginning to understand the rules of. Elena looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she had been carefully not doing for the past hour, and then she nodded once and walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when his voice reached her across the empty restaurant. "Your sister," he said. She was brave. Elena's hand tightened on the door frame. She did not turn around. She could not have said exactly why. "Yes," she said, "she was." She walked out into the cold November dark. Behind her she heard nothing, no footsteps, no voice, no sound at all. Just the quality of silence that a person leaves behind them, the particular shape of an absence that she somehow knew she would be thinking about for a very long time. 3 blocks away, she became aware of the black car that had been keeping pace with her since she left the restaurant. It maintained its distance. It did not approach. When she reached her building and put her key in the lock and stepped inside, she looked over her shoulder and saw it idling at the end of the street, unhurried, patient, not threatening, watching. She stood in her entryway in the dark for a long moment, her back against the closed door, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, where her heart was doing something she didn't have language for, and she breathed, and she thought about gray eyes and a single word spoken into an empty restaurant. Brave? She wondered who he had meant it for. The call came at 6 in the morning. Elena was already awake. She had not slept, not properly, not the deep, unconscious surrender that sleep was supposed to be. She had lain in the dark of her apartment with her eyes open, and her mind running through everything she knew, and everything she didn't know, and the particular quality of Marco Vitelli's voice when he had said her sister's name, and somewhere around 4 in the morning she had given up on sleep entirely and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the mug and waited for whatever was going to happen next. The number on her phone screen was one she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway. "There's a car outside your building," said a voice she did not know, male, flat, professionally neutral. "It will take you where you need to go. Be downstairs in 10 minutes. The line went dead. Elena looked at her phone for a moment. Then she set down her coffee, went to the window, and looked down at the street. The black car was there, idling in the pale morning gray, exactly where it had been when she came home the night before. Or perhaps a different black car. She had the sense that in Marco Vitelli's world, the black cars were essentially interchangeable instruments of a will that did not need to announce itself. She thought about not going. She examined the option carefully and honestly, the way she had learned to examine things since Sophia died, without flinching, without the comfortable softening of wishful thinking. She could not go. She could stay in this apartment and wait. She could go to the police, which she had considered 17 times in the past 6 days, and rejected each time for reasons that were complicated and painful, and which she did not have the energy to revisit at 6 in the morning. Or she could go downstairs and get in the car. She put on her coat. The car took her to a building in the financial district, glass and steel, and the kind of anonymous corporate grandeur that was specifically designed to look like it had nothing to hide. The lobby was marble. The security desk was staffed by 2 men who wore suits rather than uniforms, and who looked at her with the particular careful neutrality of people who were paid to see everything and register nothing. One of them made a brief call. The other escorted her to an elevator that required a key card he produced from his jacket pocket. The elevator opened directly into an office on the 32nd floor. It was a large room, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, the November city spread out below in the early light, gray and vast and indifferent. The furniture was dark wood, dark leather, the kind of interior that communicated wealth, not through ostentation, but through restraint. Every object in the room looked as if it had been chosen with the specific intention of being exactly what it was and nothing more. Marco was standing at the window when she entered. He was already dressed another dark suit, another precisely knotted tie, and he held a coffee cup in one hand and was looking out at the city with the expression of a man reviewing something that belonged to him. He did not turn around when she entered. "You came," he said. "You sent a car." "I send cars to a great many people." He turned then and looked at her across the room, and something in his face was different from the night before, not softer, not warmer, but more awake somehow, as if the controlled stillness of Rosario's had been replaced by something more operational. "Not all of them come." Elena crossed the room and stood on the opposite side of the large desk that occupied the center of the space. She did not sit, neither did he. "What have you found out?" He set down his coffee cup. He opened a file on the desk and turned it to face her, and she looked down at the papers inside, and what she saw made the blood in her face withdraw slowly southward. Photographs, documents, names she recognized from Sophia's paper, and names she didn't. And in the center of the top page, circled in ink, a name that made her stomach perform a slow, terrible revolution. Commissioner Aldrich Brennan, the head of the city's organized crime task force, the man who had personally signed off on the official ruling that her sister's death was accidental. Elena looked at the page for a long moment. She was aware of Marco watching her, aware of it the way you were aware of heat, something that registered on the skin before the brain caught up. She kept her eyes on the paper because she needed a moment before she could arrange her face into something that was not the raw, shaking thing she could feel trying to claw its way out from behind her sternum. "He's theirs," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "He's been theirs for 9 years, Marco said. He's how they've stayed untouchable. Every time someone got close, every time any investigation developed teeth, he shut it down, redirected resources, lost evidence, ruled deaths inconvenient." He paused. "Your sister went to his office 3 days before she came to us. She didn't know what he was. She thought he was the right person to go to." Elena closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Behind her eyelids she saw Sophia's face at the train station, pressing that coat into her hands, the fierceness of it, the urgency just barely contained beneath the surface of an ordinary good. "Bye." She opened her eyes. She trusted him. Elena said, "Yes." And he told them she was coming. "Yes." The word landed each time like a stone dropped into still water. Elena looked at the photograph of Brennan, thick-necked, silver-haired, wearing the expression of institutional authority that she now understood was a costume over something rotten, and she felt, moving through her like weather, a cold and clarifying rage. "What do you need from me?" she said. Marco looked at her. Something shifted in those gray eyes, something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, as if she had done something he had calculated as possible, but not probable. "The document," he said. "Everything Sophia collected. We've been building a case against Brennan's network for 3 years, and we've never been able to get high enough. Every thread we pull gets cut before it reaches the top. What your sister found gets us there, but only if it's complete, and only if it can be verified. It can be verified." Elena straightened. "I can verify it. I know how to read the accounts. Sophia taught me double-entry bookkeeping when I was 16 because she thought everyone should understand where money actually went. I spent 3 days with that document before I came to Rosario's. I understand what it says." She met his gaze directly. "What I need to know is what you intend to do with it. Destroy them," Marco said, simply, without drama. "The way someone might say it will rain tomorrow, legally." The pause that followed was interesting. "Where possible," he said. Elena looked at him. She looked at the city behind him, gray and vast in the morning light. She looked at the photograph of the man who had signed her sister's death certificate and called it an accident and gone home to his dinner. "All right," she said. It was not trust. She was clear-eyed about that. It was an alliance of shared interest between two people who had arrived at the same point from very different directions. And she was under no illusion about what Marco Vitelli was or what the word destroy meant in his vocabulary when it came before the word legally. but Sophia had trusted a man she thought was righteous and died for it. Elena had decided, in 11 months of grief, that righteous men were in shorter supply than advertised. He gave her a room to work in, a smaller office down the hall, equipped with a computer she did not use and a legal pad she did, and coffee that appeared at her elbow at intervals delivered by a man who came and went without making conversation. She worked through the morning with the document open in her memory, reconstructing what she knew onto paper, cross-referencing dates and amounts, and the coded names that Sophia had built a key in the margins of the original. At some point, she became aware that Marco was standing in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was writing, and then she looked up, and he was leaning against the door frame with his hands in his pockets, and looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, something attentive and remote at the same time, the way a person looked at something they were trying to understand. "You've been at it for 4 hours," he said. "I know. You haven't eaten." It was not, Elena thought, a thing she would have expected him to notice. "I'm not hungry." He was quiet for a moment. "There's food in the conference room." She looked at him. He was not quite making an order of it. He was doing the thing she had first noticed the night before in Rosario's, the thing where the command was present in his voice but wrapped in something. That left her the technical option of refusing. She was beginning to understand that this was not softness. It was the technique of a man who preferred compliance that looked like choice. "All right," she said, and set down her pen and stood. They sat at the far end of a long conference table with plates of food that someone had arranged with understated precision, and ate in a silence that was not entirely comfortable, but was not hostile either. Elena was hungrier than she had admitted. She ate methodically and thought about Sophia, and tried not to think about the way the morning light fell through these windows and made the gray in his eyes look almost blue. How long had she been collecting it? Marco said finally, not looking at her, looking at his plate. Elena set down her fork. "At least a year from what the document shows. Maybe longer." She was careful. She didn't take anything that couldn't be explained. She built the picture slowly. She paused. She was always the careful one. "I was the one who made fast decisions." She used to say, "I moved through the world like I was trying to close a distance that kept moving." A pause. "I don't know why I just told you that." Marco looked up. His eyes found hers and stayed there, and Elena had the sudden vertiginous sense of being seen with a thoroughness she had not consented to. "Because you haven't talked about her," he said. "Not really, not to anyone who was listening." The accuracy of it hit her somewhere unguarded. She looked away, out the window, at the city below. The November morning had deepened into a cold, flat gray that pressed against the glass like something waiting. "She used to call me every Sunday," Elena said after a moment, in a voice that she was keeping very carefully level. "Every Sunday, 11 o'clock without fail. She called me the Sunday before she died. She sounded normal. She asked if I'd finally fixed the leak in my kitchen ceiling." She stopped. I still haven't." The silence in the conference room was different from the silence at Rosario's. That silence had been taut, strategic, 2 people measuring each other across a chessboard. This silence was something else. It had weight and warmth to it, the specific temperature of grief acknowledged by another human being. Marco did not say he was sorry. He did not offer the standard verbal gestures that people offered in the presence of other people's loss. He simply remained present, in the particular way she was beginning to identify as specific to him, fully there, fully attending, giving nothing, and yet somehow giving something she couldn't name. His hand rested on the table, 6 inches from hers. He did not move it. She did not move hers. They sat like that for a moment that lasted longer than moments were supposed to last, and then Elena picked up her fork and went back to eating, and the world rearranged itself into the shape of a conversation that had not quite happened. It was mid-afternoon when everything changed. Elena was back in the small office, deep in the reconstruction of the financial records, when she heard voices in the corridor, not loud, but with an urgency that cut through the door. She put down her pen. 2 seconds later, Marco appeared in the doorway, and the expression on his face was the one she had not seen before, stripped of the careful control, running hotter and faster than he would have preferred. "We have a problem," he said. She stood up. "What kind?" "The kind that means someone already knows you're here." The room seemed to contract slightly. Elena looked at him and understood, from the quality of the tension in his frame, that this was not a theoretical concern. "How? I don't know yet." He crossed to her desk in 3 strides and picked up the legal pad she had been writing on. He looked at it, then looked at her. "Is this everything?" "No, but it's a start." He held her gaze for 1 beat too. "Can you finish it from memory?" "Yes." "Then we're leaving." He moved toward the door and then stopped and turned back. And for the first time since she had met him, he reached out and touched her, not aggressively, not commandingly, but with the focused urgency of a man who needed her to move and understood that ordering her to move was not the same as her moving. His hand closed around her wrist, briefly, warm and firm. "Stay close to me," he said. It was not the words. It was the way he said them, with something underneath the command that she felt rather than heard. Something that sounded almost like it mattered whether she was all right. Almost. Elena picked up her coat and followed him out the door into whatever was coming next. The car moved through the city at a speed that was fast without being conspicuous. Marco sat beside her in the back seat, not touching her, not looking at her, his attention entirely forward on the driver, on the phone in his hand, on whatever tactical calculation was running. Behind those gray eyes at a speed she could not follow. He made 2 calls in the first 5 minutes, both brief, both in a clipped shorthand that told her almost nothing except that people on the other end of the line were already moving, already repositioning, already enacting instructions that had been prepared for exactly this kind of contingency. He was a man who had planned for everything. She found this, under the circumstances, deeply reassuring and deeply unsettling in equal measure. Elena sat with her hands in her lap and watched the city move past the tinted windows and tried to map what she knew onto what she didn't. Someone had found out she was at the building, someone with the reach to know Marco Vitelli's movements, his locations, his operational infrastructure. That was not a small someone. That was someone embedded deep enough in the architecture of the city to see things that were specifically designed not to be seen. Brennan, she thought, or someone working for the same people Brennan worked for. She thought about Sophia walking into that office with a folder full of evidence and a face full of trust, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere they won't have had time to prepare for." Marco did not look up from his phone. "I own a building in the merchant quarter, off the books, not connected to any of my registered assets. We've used it twice in the past 5 years. It's not in any file that anyone outside my innermost circle has access to." "Your innermost circle," Elena said carefully. "How many people is that?" He looked up then. Met her eyes. 4, he said, including Caruso. "And you trust all 4? The pause was very brief, nearly undetectable. "I trust 3 of them with certainty," he said. "The 4th I trust with everything except this." Elena absorbed this. "So someone in your circle told them I was there. Someone told them something. Whether it was deliberate or careless, I don't know yet." His jaw tightened. "I will know before tonight." There was a quality to the last 3 words that Elena decided not to examine too closely. She looked back out the window. The merchant quarter was an older part of the city, narrower streets, older buildings, the kind of neighborhood that had been expensive 100 years ago and had cycled through several other identities since and was now in the process of becoming expensive again. The car pulled into a narrow alley between 2 buildings and stopped at a metal door that had no markings. One of Marco's men was already there, waiting, and the door was open before Elena had finished getting out of the car. Inside was a space that had once been a warehouse and had been converted into something functional without much attention to comfort. Exposed brick, high ceilings, industrial lighting turned low. There were 2 rooms partitioned off at the far end, a table with a laptop and several phones, a coffee machine, the particular Spartan quality of a place that was maintained for use rather than habitation. Elena looked around. She thought about what it meant to have a life that required this kind of infrastructure, the hidden buildings, the contingency plans, the innermost circles, and the calibrated trusts. She thought about what it cost to live inside that architecture every day without exit. She thought about his hand on her wrist. She stopped thinking about his hand on her wrist. Caruso arrived 20 minutes later, and Marco pulled him into the corner near the door and spoke to him in a voice too low for Alina to hear. She sat at the table with the legal pad Marco had brought from the office and continued reconstructing Sophia's records, because the work was what mattered and because focusing on the work was the only reliable mechanism she had for not focusing on the accelerating speed of everything else. She was 2/3 through the reconstruction when she heard the tone of Marco's voice change. She did not look up, but she listened. "Say it again," Marco said, very quietly. Caruso's response was inaudible. Marco said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to be alarming. Then he said, in a voice that was so controlled it was almost colorless, "Leave us." Footsteps. The door. Silence. Alina looked up. Marco was standing with his back to her, facing the brick wall, one hand at his side and one hand pressed flat against the wall as if he needed something to push against. His shoulders were set with a rigidity that was different from his usual contained stillness. This was not control. This was the effort of maintaining control in the face of something that wanted to break it. She set down her pen. "What happened?" she said. He did not answer immediately. The silence between his back and her question had a texture to it, rough, uneven, not the smooth, deliberate silence of a man who was choosing his words, but the ragged silence of a man who was choosing his reaction, the fourth person. He said finally, without turning around, "In my circle." Alina waited. "His name is Dante. He's been with me for 12 years. A pause. He has a daughter, 7 years old. They took her this morning." Another pause. Each one heavier than the last. "He told them where you were. He told them where you were, and then he called me and told me what he'd done. Because he is not, because he stopped." Marco turned around. Alina had braced herself in some unconscious preparatory way. For anger, the cold, controlled, weaponized version of it she had sensed in him since the beginning. The kind of anger that moved like a blade rather than a flame. What she had not braced herself for was what was actually on his face. It was not anger. Or it was anger, but underneath the anger, visible in the particular set of his mouth and the line across his brow and the quality of his eyes, gray and dark and for one unguarded moment, uncalibrated, was something that looked like grief. He stood in the low industrial light of the warehouse and looked at her. And for one moment that would not be repeated, that closed over as quickly as it had opened like a wave pulling back from a shore, she saw through the architecture of him to something that had been living underneath it for a very long time. A man who had built an empire of control because something in him knew the cost of being uncontrolled. A man who had made himself into a machine because the alternative was being something that could be hurt. And then the moment was gone. His face settled back into its planes and angles, and the gray eyes became strategic again. And he crossed to the table and picked up his phone and began making calls. But Alina sat very still with the legal pad in front of her and the pen in her hand, and she felt something in her chest perform a slow, tectonic shift that she recognized with profound inconvenience as the beginning of understanding him. The child's name was Lucia. She was 7 years old, and she had a gap in her front teeth from a lost baby tooth, and she liked horses and strawberry gelato, and she had been taken from outside her school at 8:15 that morning by 2 men in a gray van, while her father was dropping her off and watching her walk through the gate. And then, in the 3 seconds it took him to look down at his phone, she was gone. Marco had this information within an hour. He had it because he had people in 17 different positions throughout the city, whose specific function was to know things quickly, and they had performed their function with the terrible efficiency of a system that had been built for exactly this kind of crisis. He had also, within the same hour, received a message from the people who had taken Lucia, through a channel that Alina did not ask about and Marco did not explain. The message contained 2 things: a photograph of Lucia sitting in an unfamiliar room holding a stuffed rabbit that was clearly not hers. Her expression confused and frightened but physically unharmed, and a list of demands. The list was short. The primary demand was the document. The secondary demand was Alina. Marco set his phone face down on the table with a precision that Alina recognized as the physical equivalent of a door being closed on something. He sat across from her at the table and looked at the legal pad between them and said nothing. Alina looked at the legal pad too. She looked at 3 days of her sister's life translated into her own handwriting, the architecture of 4 years of careful, quiet, brave documentation. She thought about Sophia at the train station. She thought about a gap-toothed 7-year-old in an unfamiliar room holding someone else's rabbit. "No," Marco said. She looked up. He was watching her face. "No," he said again, with a quiet finality that left no room for the argument he had clearly anticipated. "That is not a conversation we are having. She's a child," Alina said. "I know what she is, and I know what those people will do the moment they have what they want from you. I know it with a certainty that is not speculation. You do not go to them. That is not negotiable." And Lucia, his jaw tightened. "I will get her back." "How? That is not your concern." The familiar edge had returned to his voice, the cold, commanding register that she suspected most people did not push against. Alina looked at him and felt the pull of it, the pressure of it, and pushed anyway. "It is my concern," she said steadily, "because she is being used as leverage against information that my sister died collecting, and that I have spent 6 days deciding how to use and who to trust with. So yes, Marco, it is my concern." His name in her mouth, the first time she had used it directly, without the formal distance of Mr. Vitelli or the careful neutrality of you, landed in the room between them with a weight neither of them had expected. He looked at her, she looked back. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Not the cold silence of the restaurant, not the warm silence of the conference room, but something new, charged and careful. 2 people at the edge of a threshold neither of them had planned. "Approach, I have a location," he said finally. His voice was different, not softer, but less armored, as if some layer of it had been set aside for reasons he had not fully authorized. "One of my people tracked the van. I know the building. I'm going tonight. I'm coming with you." "No, Marco." Again. His name again. He stood up abruptly and turned away, and she watched his shoulders carry the weight of everything: Lucia, Dante, the document, the people who had built an empire of violence and called it business, and whatever was happening in this warehouse between himself and a woman he had met less than 24 hours ago, and could not seem to stop listening to. "You are not a field operative," he said to the wall. "You have no training. If something goes wrong. Alina said quietly, "It will go wrong whether I'm here or there. At least there I might be useful." He turned back around. He looked at her with those storm, gray eyes that were doing the thing she had stopped trying to name. The thing where they saw her too completely, where they didn't look away when most people would have looked away. "Why?" he said, and it was not a strategic question. It was not a tactical calculation. It was a real question, asked by someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Why does it matter to you this much? The child isn't yours. The risk isn't something you were trained for. You could walk away from all of this right now, and I would." He stopped. "You would what?" Alina said softly. He did not answer. The thing he had been about to say remained unspoken in the air between them, and she could feel the shape of it the way you could feel the shape of a word you'd forgotten, present and inaccessible. "At the same time, she's 7 years old," Alina said into the silence, "and she's frightened, and I know what it is to be a child in a frightening situation with no one coming." She paused. "Someone should always come." Marco Vitelli looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face that she had no map for, some internal negotiation between the man who never showed anything, and whatever it was that had been pressing against that surface. Since the night before, he sat back down, he picked up his phone. He looked at the legal pad between them, and then he looked at her, and what she saw in his expression then was not warmth, not softness, not any of the things that stories were supposed to build toward. It was something starker and more real than that, something that looked like recognition, like a man encountering, in someone else, a wound that rhymed with his own. "We go at midnight," he said, And you do exactly what I tell you, every word, every second. Elena nodded. And after, he said and stopped, and seemed to make a decision about something she couldn't see. After, you tell me about the leak in your kitchen ceiling. She stared at him. He had already looked back down at his phone. Elena sat very still in the low light of the warehouse, and felt her heart do something complicated and unwanted in her chest, and she pressed her lips together, and she went back to work. Midnight came in cold and absolute. The building was a disused textile warehouse 3 miles east of the merchant quarter, in a part of the city that the development money had not yet reached block after block of industrial architecture left to the slow grammar of rust and broken glass. The streets empty at this hour, except for the kind of dark that collected in places where no one was supposed to be. Marco's team moved through it with a precision that was almost silent. 4 men in dark clothing who communicated in gestures and who treated the darkness the way experienced swimmers treated water. As a medium, they understood and moved through with confidence rather than fear. Elena moved with them and did exactly what she had been told. She had been given, before they left the warehouse, a brief and entirely non-negotiable set of instructions by Marco, delivered in a voice so stripped of ornamentation that it functioned almost like architecture load, bearing structural, not decorative. She was to stay within 3 feet of him at all times. She was to make no sound unless he addressed her. She was to move when he moved and stop when he stopped, and under no circumstances was she to act on independent judgment. He had delivered these instructions while looking at her with an expression that said he was fully aware she was a person who operated on independent judgment and was asking her, for this specific period of time, to override that. She had agreed. She had meant it. She meant it now, moving through the cold dark behind him, close enough to see the set of his shoulders, the controlled economy of his movement, the way his attention swept and catalogued the space around them with the continuous low-level vigilance of someone for whom danger was not an emergency, but a permanent atmospheric condition. The building had 3 entry points. Marco's team took the east side. 2 of his men circled to cover the exits. Marco and Elena went through a ground floor window that someone had already cleared of glass with a thoroughness that told her this had been reconnoitered before tonight. Inside, the air smelled of old machinery and cold concrete, and something chemical that she couldn't name. The darkness was deeper here, the kind of complete dark that pressed against the eyes, and Marco produced a small flashlight that he held low, throwing a narrow beam across the floor. He moved without hesitation, which meant he had either a map or a memory of the space, and Elena followed and kept her breathing quiet and thought about Lucia and her stuffed rabbit, and did not think about anything else. They found her on the 2nd floor, a room in the northeast corner, secured with a padlock that one of Marco's men dealt with in under 30 seconds. Inside, on a folding cot, wrapped in a coat that was several sizes too large for her, a 7-year-old girl with a gap in her front teeth was asleep with her cheek pressed against a stuffed rabbit that was not hers, but that she had clearly decided to keep anyway. Marco stopped in the doorway. Elena looked at him. In the thin light of the flashlight, she could see the side of his face, and what was on it was so unguarded, so entirely outside the register of everything she had seen from him in the past 24 hours that she had to look away. It was not weakness. It was the opposite of weakness. It was the face of a man who had compartmentalized the human parts of himself so efficiently, for so long, that when they surfaced with the force of something that had been held underwater. He crossed to the cot in 3 strides. He crouched down. He put one hand very gently on the child's shoulder and said her name quietly, and Lucia's eyes opened, and she looked at him. And then she made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob, and she sat up and pressed her face against his shoulder, and Marco Vitelli put his arm around a 7-year-old girl in a dark room in an abandoned warehouse and held her with a steadiness that Elena understood, watching, was the most honest thing she had seen him do. She turned away to give him the privacy of it. She faced the dark corridor and listened to the small sounds of a frightened child being talked down from fear by a man who was not supposed to know how to do that, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been building since the conference room, since his hand on her wrist, Since the moment she had seen through the architecture of him to the grief underneath, she felt it complete itself into something she no longer had the energy or the dishonesty to misname. She was in serious trouble. They were back at the warehouse by 2 in the morning. Lucia, overwhelmed with the specific exhaustion of a child who has been frightened and then relieved, fell asleep in the car before they had traveled 2 blocks. Dante was there when they arrived, white-faced, hollow-eyed, a man who had done the only thing he could have done and was going to live with it anyway, and Marco handed the sleeping child to her father without speaking and looked at Dante for a moment with an expression Elena could not fully read from across the room. Then he said, very quietly, "We'll talk tomorrow." It was not forgiveness. It was not condemnation. It was something more human than either. The acknowledgement that a person could do a terrible thing for a reason that was real, and that the accounting for it could wait until the most urgent thing was over. Dante left with Lucia in his arms, and the warehouse felt different after they were gone, slightly too large, the industrial silence pressing in from the high ceiling like a weight. Marco stood in the center of the room, with his back to her. Elena set down her jacket. She looked at the legal pad on the table, still covered in her handwriting, still carrying the careful record of everything Sophia had built. She thought about what the night had cost, and what it had found, and what was still unresolved, running underneath all of it like a current. She thought about what Marco had almost said in the warehouse earlier. "You could walk away from all of this right now, and I would." She crossed the room. She stopped behind him, close enough to speak without raising her voice, and she said, "What were you going to say earlier?" He did not turn around. "Elena, you stopped yourself. You've stopped yourself 3 times since last night. I've noticed each time." She paused. "You could walk away from all of this right now, and you would what?" The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he turned around. He was closer than she had calibrated. The room had contracted somehow in the past few seconds, or she had moved without registering it, and he was standing near enough that she could see every line of his face in the low warehouse light, all the architecture of it, the controlled angles, and the thing beneath them that was neither controlled nor angular, but was present and unmistakable. "I would not let you," he said. The words came out stripped of everything except what they were. No strategy in them, no calculation, just the sentence, flat and true, landing in the space between them with the weight of something that had been held back for longer than one day. Elena looked at him. Why? Because he stopped, his jaw moved. She watched him fight with himself, watched the man who did not explain himself, did not feel, did not allow anything to move him, wage a brief and visible war against the fact that something had moved him. "Because you came here alone," he said finally, and his voice was lower than she had heard it, rough at the edges in a way it hadn't been before. "With nothing except a number on a bill, and 11 months of grief, and a dead sister's evidence, and no guarantee of anything. Because you sat across from me in that restaurant, and you were not afraid, and I have spent 8 years in rooms with people who were afraid of me, and I had forgotten." He stopped again. "Forgotten what?" Elena said softly. "What it looks like," he said, "when someone isn't." The silence that followed was the one she would remember. Not the silence of the restaurant, strategic and cold. Not the silence of the conference room, warm with acknowledged grief. This silence was the one that happened when 2 people had arrived at the edge of something, and were standing there together, and neither of them was pretending they weren't. His hand came up, slowly, with none of the rapid decisiveness of the man who moved through crises like water. Slowly and with a deliberateness that was not the deliberateness of control but of care. The specific care of someone who was doing something that mattered to them, and did not want to do it wrong. His hand came up, and his fingers touched her face, just at the jaw, barely, the lightest possible contact, as if he was verifying that she was real. Elena stood very still. She did not pull back, she did not step forward. She simply stood in the low warehouse light, and let him look at her the way he was looking at her, with a thoroughness and a rawness that she understood was not something he gave easily or often, or perhaps at all, and she breathed. "I haven't done this," he said. The admission was rough and quiet, and she understood it was not an apology or a disclaimer but a truth, the specific truth of a man who had chosen, a long time ago, to be a certain kind of person, and was standing at the edge of a different choice. "I know," she said. "It's not, I can't offer you," he stopped. "Start it again, the life I have, what it is. I can't, I haven't asked you for anything," she said quietly. "I haven't asked you for anything since I sat down at your table." He looked at her. She looked back. And then something in him, something that had been held at tremendous cost for a very long time, gave way. He kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss that happened in the final act of stories about powerful men and strong women, the cinematic collision of two people who have been circling each other. It was quieter than that and more devastating. It was the kiss of a man who had decided, after years of deciding nothing of this kind, to stop deciding against it. Careful and deliberate, and, beneath that, aching the specific ache of something that has been denied so long, it has become its own kind of hunger. Elena's hands came up to his jacket, not gripping, just resting, as if she needed to confirm the solid reality of him, and he kissed her in the low light of the warehouse with the legal pad full of her sister's evidence on the table beside them, and the cold November night pressed against the walls outside, and everything unresolved and unfinished hanging in the air around them like weather. When they separated, they were both very still. Marco's hand was still at her jaw. His thumb moved once, barely, against her cheekbone. His eyes were open, and they were looking at her with something in them, that she had no previous data for, something that was not the gray storm strategic remoteness she had catalogued over the past day, but was open, present, entirely unguarded. It lasted only a moment. She watched it carefully because she understood it was rare and she did not want to waste it. Then it began slowly to close, not all the way, not back to where it had been. But the architecture began to reassemble, gently, like a house settling back into its shape after something has moved through it. "The document," he said. His voice was steady, but only barely. "Tomorrow. We move on Brennan tomorrow." Elena nodded. "You'll need to give a formal statement. To people I trust, not Brennan's people. There are prosecutors, federal level, who have been trying to build this case for 2 years. I have a contact." "All right. It will be public. Your name will be attached to it. There's no way around that. I know." He looked at her. "Are you ready for that?" Elena thought about Sophia's handwriting. Small and precise and careful, building a case in the margins of a document hidden in a coat, left in the hands of a sister she trusted. Building it because it needed to be built, because someone had to. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Something moved through his face, brief and complicated, and somewhere in the register of pride and sorrow pressed together. He lowered his hand from her face. He stepped back, and the physical distance between them was restored, and the warehouse was just a warehouse again. But the thing that had happened in it did not unhappen. That was not how things worked. Elena had learned that earlier than most and more painfully. The things that happened in the dark, in the spaces between decisions, in the moments when people stopped performing and started simply being, those things left marks. They persisted. They changed the shape of whatever came after. She picked up the legal pad. She picked up her pen. She sat back down at the table and went back to work. And Marco sat across from her and made calls in a low voice. And the November night pressed against the walls of the warehouse, and outside, somewhere in the city, Commissioner Aldrich Brennan was sleeping in the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had one night left of believing that. The morning came in pale and cold and certain. Elena had slept for 3 hours on a cot in the partitioned room at the back of the warehouse. A sleep that was not restful, but was deep in the way that exhaustion eventually forces the body, overruling the mind's insistence on remaining vigilant. She woke before the alarm she had set, in the gray preed, on light that came through a single high window, and she lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling and let the full weight of everything settle over her the way it always did in those first waking seconds, before the self had fully reconstructed its defenses. Sophia, Brennan, the document, Marco. She sat up. She dressed. She walked out into the main space of the warehouse and found Marco already there, already dressed, already on the phone, already 3 moves ahead in the game that was about to end or escalate, depending on variables she could not fully see. He looked up when she entered. Something passed across his face, brief, almost imperceptible, and then he returned to his call. She made coffee. She set a cup beside him without interrupting. He looked at the cup and then at her, and the look lasted 1 second longer than it needed to. She understood that this was, from him, a great deal. The federal contact arrived at 8. His name was Ray's, compact, careful, with the particular watchful quality of a man who had spent years working in the overlap between law and the people who broke it, and who had developed a finely calibrated instinct for which side of that overlap he was currently standing on. He shook Elena's hand and looked at the legal pad she handed him and spent 40 minutes reading it in silence while Marco sat across the table. And Caruso stood by the door and the warehouse held its breath. Reyes looked up. "This is sufficient," he said. "Combined with what we already have, this is sufficient." 3 words. Sufficient, combined, this. Elena felt something release in her chest that had been held since the train station, 14 months ago. Since Sophia pressed a coat into her hands with the urgency of someone leaving instructions. Not resolution. Resolution was too clean a word, too final for something this complicated. But movement. The grinding, costly movement of something enormous beginning, at last, to shift. "The account number," Reyes said, looking at Marco. "You can access it by noon," Marco said. "Freeze it at noon. I'll have the warrants by 10. Reyes stood. He looked at Elena for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "Your sister," he said. "She built this. I want you to know that we knew something was there. We've known for 2 years. We just couldn't find the thread." He paused. "She found it." Elena looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "She did." Reyes nodded once, the professional acknowledgement of someone who understood what that cost, and left. The warehouse was quiet. Elena stood at the table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the legal pad. Her handwriting, Sophia's information, 2 sisters and 14 months, and a number written on a restaurant bill, and she felt the grief move through her the way it sometimes did, cleanly and completely. Not the chronic ache of ordinary days, but the acute, clarifying grief of a moment when the thing you have been carrying finally, partially, sets down. She did not hear him cross the room. She was aware of him behind her before he spoke, the specific gravity of him, the way his presence altered the air. "Elena," she turned around. He was standing close as he had been the night before, and his face had the same quality it had carried in the low warehouse light after the kiss. Not fully open, not fully closed. Something in between that was more honest than either extreme. He was holding something. She looked down. It was a small, folded piece of paper, and he held it out to her with a deliberateness that was not the deliberateness of a man handing over a document. She took it, unfolded it. It was a photograph, small, worn at the folds, clearly carried for a long time. 2 people at a table in a restaurant. She didn't recognize a man who was younger than she had ever seen Marco, but unmistakably him. The same angles, the same controlled attention, and a woman with dark hair and a smile that reached her eyes all the way, no frosted glass, nothing held back. Elena looked at the photograph for a moment. She looked up at him. "Who is she?" "My mother," he said. "She died when I was 19. A pause. She used to say that the bravest thing a person could do was stay in a room when every instinct was telling them to run. Another pause, shorter, rougher at the edges. "I have thought about that a great deal in the past 36 hours. Elena looked at the photograph again, at the woman with the unguarded smile, at the young man beside her, who had not yet learned to hold everything back. She refolded it carefully along its original creases and held it out. Marco looked at her hand for a moment. Then he took the photograph and put it back in his pocket, and the gesture was so ordinary and so intimate, the returning of something precious to the place where it lived, that Elena had to look away briefly at nothing in particular and collect herself. "What happens now?" she said, meaning the case. "Meaning Brennan, meaning all of it. Now Ray's moves," Marco said. "It will be fast. It has to be fast before Brennan realizes the account is frozen and understands what that means. There will be arrests. There will be a great deal of noise. He paused. Some of it will touch things close to me. I want you to know that before it happens. Elena looked at him. You mean it will come out that you were involved? Some of it. Reyes and I have an arrangement that is long-standing. He understands what I am. I understand what he needs. There is a version of this morning that is manageable for both of us. He met her eyes, but it is not a clean version. It is not the version where I am the hero of the story. I never thought you were the hero of the story, Elena said quietly. Something shifted in his face. No, he said. I know. I thought you were the person who could actually get it done, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was stronger now, coming through the high windows at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it visible, particles of the ordinary world, suspended, briefly illuminated. After this, he said carefully, I cannot promise you. He stopped. Began again, more precisely, the way a man spoke when he was determined not to say something that wasn't true just because it would be easier. I cannot promise you that the life I have is compatible with, I don't know how to, Marco, Elena said. He stopped. I'm not asking you to promise me anything, she said. I haven't asked you for a single promise since the night I sat down at your table. I asked you to help me finish what my sister started. That's what I came for. She paused. Everything else, she stopped. Everything else, he said softly. Everything else is something neither of us planned for. He looked at her. She looked back. The morning pressed against the warehouse windows, insistent and arriving, the city beyond it beginning its ordinary loud business of being a city, indifferent to the specific weight of what was happening in this room between these two people. His hand came up again, not to her face this time. He reached out and his fingers closed around hers briefly, deliberately, not the urgent grip of the office, not the careful touch of the night before, but something in between, something that was neither tactical nor romantic, but was simply the act of one person holding onto another in the middle of everything. She held on back. For exactly that moment and no longer. And then his phone rang, and the morning became the morning, operational, urgent, moving at the speed of consequences finally arriving, and they separated. And Marco answered the call, and Elena picked up her coat and prepared for whatever the next hours were going to be. By noon, the account was frozen. By 1:30, the warrants had been executed. By 3 in the afternoon, Commissioner Aldrich Brennan was being walked out of his office building by federal agents, while a photographer who had been told exactly where to stand captured it in an image that would be on every front page by morning. He walked with the rigid, forward-facing expression of a man who had decided that dignity was the last thing he could keep, and he kept it all the way to the car. And then the car door closed, and he was gone. Elena watched it on the small screen of Caruso's phone, standing in the merchant quarter in the cold afternoon light, and she felt not triumph, because triumph was the wrong shape for it. Something quieter and more durable than triumph. The specific feeling of a debt paid that could never fully balance the books, because the books of certain losses did not balance, would never balance, but could be acknowledged. Could be marked, Sophia, she thought. Do you see it? She looked up at the November sky, gray and vast and indifferent, and she breathed, and she let the grief and the relief run together the way rivers ran when they finally reached the same level, and she stood there in the cold until both of them had passed. When she turned around, Marco was behind her. He had come from wherever he had been, the calls, the arrangements, the careful management of consequences, and he was standing on the pavement with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her with the expression she had catalogued and still could not entirely read, the one that lived in the narrow country between remoteness and something warmer. It's done, he said. Not entirely, Elena said. There will be trials. It will take months, maybe longer, yes. And Brennan will have lawyers who are very good at their jobs. Yes, but he will also have Reyes, who is better. A pause. And he will have what your sister built, which is better still. Elena looked at him. The afternoon light was thin and direct, winter light, the kind that showed everything clearly. She looked at him clearly. I'm going to go home, she said. I need to sleep in my own bed. I need a few days of ordinary things." He nodded. This was not dismissal. He understood it. "The ceiling," he said. She blinked. "What? The leak?" The faintest thing crossed his face, not quite a smile. Something that was in the neighborhood of a smile. Something that had the same warmth, without quite the shape. "You said you haven't fixed it." "I haven't. I know someone," he said. "A contractor. He's reliable and he doesn't overcharge, and he will fix it without requiring you to be present, which I suspect you would prefer." Elena looked at him for a long moment. She looked at this man who ran half the city's underworld with the cold precision of a machine, and who had carried his mother's photograph folded so small it was nearly invisible, and who had held a 7-year-old girl in a dark warehouse, and who had kissed her in the low light with the specific careful hunger of someone doing something they had decided to stop deciding against. She looked at all of that, at the whole complicated truth of him, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had stopped mislabeling settle quietly into what it actually was. Not simple, not safe, not the kind of thing that resolved into clean lines and clear futures, but real. Undeniably, inconveniently, completely real. "All right," she said. "Give me his number." Marco reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a card, plain, white, a phone number in clean type and nothing else, and he held it out. Elena took it. Their fingers did not quite touch this time, and somehow that was more charged than when they had. She put the card in her pocket. She looked at him one last time in the thin November light. "Marco," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you." She paused. "For my sister." Something moved through his face that she felt rather than saw. A long, slow movement, like the movement of weather through a landscape that had not seen rain in a long time. He stood with it for a moment, and she let him stand with it and did not look away. "She deserved better," he said quietly. "Then what happened to her?" "Yes," Elena said. "She did." They stood in the cold afternoon in the merchant quarter with the city running its loud, indifferent life around them. And then Elena turned and walked away, and she did not look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood with the bone. Deep certainty of a woman who had learned the weight of things left unfinished, that this was not an ending. This was the pause between sentences. She was 2 blocks away when her phone buzzed. She stopped, looked at the screen. An unknown number, a message, 6 words, no punctuation, no signature, Sunday, 11 o'clock, I'll call. Elena stood on the pavement in the November cold and read the message twice and felt something that was entirely new and entirely terrifying and entirely, devastatingly alive move through her from her feet to the crown of her head. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked up at the gray November sky. And for the first time in 11 months, she smiled, not the smile that went to a certain depth and stopped, not the smile through frosted glass, but the real one, the unguarded one, the one that reached all the way. She walked home through the cold with her sister's evidence filed in federal hands and a contractor's number in her pocket, and 6 words on her phone that she would read 17 more times before morning. Somewhere across the city, in the corner table of a restaurant that smelled of real wax candles and excellent wine, a man who did not smile sat alone in the chair that faced the door and turned his wine glass a quarter turn on the white linen tablecloth and allowed himself, in the privacy of an empty room, one moment of something that was not coldness and not control and not the careful architecture of a man who had decided long ago to feel nothing. One moment of something that felt, against all probability and planning, exactly like the beginning of something. The candle on the table burned steadily. Outside, November pressed against the glass. And inside, in the particular silence of a man who had just remembered what it was to want something. Not power, not control, not the cold satisfaction of a machine running correctly. Something warm and real and worth the cost of wanting. Marco Vitelli sat alone with his wine and his mother's photograph and 6 words he had sent into the cold afternoon, and waited for Sunday.